June 15, 1943, Fort Riley, Kansas. Gefreiter Heinrich Müller held the small denomination bills in his hand with reverence. 80 cents, American currency, payment for a day's work as a laborer in the camp compound. The 28-year-old German soldier, captured 6 months earlier during the North African campaign, stared at the money as though it might disappear. In Germany, as a frontline soldier receiving combat pay, he earned approximately 40 cents per day, yet that 40 cents had been deducted from his wages to support the war effort, leaving him with virtually nothing. Here, in American captivity, he had already accumulated nearly $5 over 6 weeks of work. Money that was actually his. Money that represented opportunity. Money that could be exchanged for something that had become as mythical in German culture as dragons or unicorns, abundant consumer goods. Müller walked toward the camp canteen, a wooden structure that resembled a small grocery store more than a military facility. The door was unlocked. American soldiers trusted prisoners to shop without guard supervision. The concept alone was revolutionary. Inside, the shelves were stocked with items that had disappeared from German civilian life years ago. Cartons of American cigarettes, cases of beer, actual beer, not the watered-down substitutes that had become standard in Germany, boxes of chocolate bars, cans of condensed milk, fresh fruit sometimes, depending on season, chewing gum, soap, matches, writing paper, postage stamps. The inventory represented abundance so casually displayed that it shattered German expectations in seconds. Müller purchased a carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes for $1.50. He bought a bar of Hershey's chocolate for a dime. He bought a can of beer for 15 cents. He stood in that canteen holding products that German civilians had been unable to purchase for years, products that symbolized American industrial capacity more effectively than any weapons demonstration. The implications of that single transaction rippled through every German prisoner of war camp across the United States. For the first time in their lives, ordinary German soldiers possessed disposable income. Not as military employees receiving meager combat pay, but as workers in a capitalist economy where labor was compensated and workers could actually retain earnings. The American system assigned each prisoner an identification number that corresponded to a ledger account. Wages were credited to this account. Prisoners could withdraw funds at the camp canteen. The system was transparent, auditable, and fundamentally alien to German military experience. German soldiers had never received wages they could actually spend. They received rations, uniforms, equipment, and minimal personal allowances that were heavily taxed to support state priorities. American prisoners received actual payment, calculated at 80 cents per day, for voluntary labor that included agricultural work, construction, maintenance, and manufacturing support. The German military had attempted to prepare prisoners for American captivity with indoctrination about capitalist exploitation and materialist decadence. American capitalism would attempt to corrupt them through consumer goods. The capitalist system would create artificial desires and breed moral weakness. What actually happened was something that Nazi ideology had never anticipated. The abundance wasn't a trap. It was an explanation, an answer to the fundamental question that had haunted German military thinking since 1941. How could America continue fighting effectively against an economically superior German Reich? The answer stood on the shelves of that canteen. America could afford to pay prisoners. America could afford to stock canteens with luxury goods. America could afford to treat enemies with material generosity because American productive capacity was simply incomprehensible to minds shaped by German scarcity. The labor that generated these wages became another revelation. German prisoners worked in American agriculture, harvesting crops that exceeded German production by orders of magnitude. They helped construct American military facilities on a scale that suggested unlimited resources. They worked in factories producing goods at a tempo that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. For every day of work, they received their 80 cents. But the real value wasn't the money itself. It was what the money represented. a functioning capitalist economy where labor was rewarded, where workers retained purchasing power, where consumer goods were so abundant they could be sold casually in camp canteens to enemy prisoners. The letters that prisoners sent home became the most effective anti-Nazi propaganda of the war, though that was never their intention. Gefreiter Hans Dietrich, captured at Kasserine Pass and held at Camp Forest in Tennessee, wrote to his family in September 1943, "They pay us for our work, 80 cents per day. I can purchase cigarettes, real tobacco, not the sawdust substitutes you have described in your letters. I can buy chocolate, American chocolate, real chocolate with cocoa butter, not the chicory mixture that passes for chocolate at home. I bought a carton of cigarettes and sent a package to the family of Otto Feldman. They arrived safely. His sister wrote that such goods were unimaginable treasures. Here, the canteen manager hardly noticed when I purchased them." The wages accumulated. Prisoners who worked steadily could accumulate substantial savings over months of captivity. Some prisoners deliberately avoided spending, building reserves that they planned to take home or send to families. The mathematics were staggering from a German perspective. A German army private earned approximately 400 to 500 marks monthly. This was before deductions. An American private earned roughly $50 monthly, and prisoners earned approximately $24 monthly at 80 cents per day. But crucially, they were not required to share this with the state. The money was theirs. By war's end, some long-term prisoners had accumulated savings equivalent to several months of German military wages. Feldwebel Ernst Wagner, captured in 1942 and held until 1946, accumulated approximately $500 in his camp account. $500. In Germany, this represented a year and a half of officers' salary. The accumulated wealth was almost incomprehensible. The canteen economy became the foundation of prisoner culture. The morning shift workers would pool their resources to collectively purchase larger quantities of items, creating informal economies of trade. Cigarettes became a quasi-currency more reliable than American dollars. The ratio was approximately 1 carton for $5 of purchasing power. Someone would calculate that by purchasing 15 pounds of sugar, rationing it carefully, they could resell it at modest profit to prisoners desperate for sweetness. Others would purchase soap and trade it for other necessities. The economy within the camps became a demonstration of capitalist principles operating freely. It also demonstrated something equally powerful, the difference between scarcity and abundance. In Germany, the Nazi state controlled consumer goods through a rationing system designed to prioritize military production. In American camps, prisoners could simply purchase what they wanted if they had accumulated the funds. The contrast was devastating to Nazi ideology. The simple act of purchasing a beer became a philosophical statement. German soldiers in the Wehrmacht rarely encountered beer in their final years of service. Alcohol production had been curtailed to preserve grain supplies. The barracks of German military units were dry. Yet in American camps, prisoners could purchase beer at the canteen. Real beer, brewed by American breweries, stocked in abundance. 1 carton of beer cost approximately 30 cents. A prisoner working standard labor could purchase 1 beer every other day if desired. The availability wasn't a significant economic fact. It was a psychological fact. It demonstrated that America could afford to provide beer to prisoners during wartime. Gefreiter Müller wrote in his hidden diary, "I purchased a beer today. Domestic beer produced here in America. I drank it in the barracks while reading a letter from home describing the restrictions there. My sister mentions rationing so severe that real beer is unavailable even on the black market. Here, I can purchase it with wages earned in captivity. This is not decadence on the part of America. This is evidence of capability beyond imagination." The cigarettes held particular significance. Smoking was endemic to military culture. German soldiers received cigarette rations as part of their military compensation. As the war progressed and German production declined, cigarette rations were reduced. Some units received substitutes made from herbs and dried leaves, cigarettes so foul that soldiers preferred doing without. American prisoners in German camps reported that acquiring a real cigarette had become a precious commodity. Here, in American camps, Lucky Strikes and Chesterfields were available at the canteen. Prisoners could purchase a full carton for $1.50. The availability was so casual that guards didn't prevent prisoners from purchasing them in large quantities. Some prisoners sent entire cartons home through the mail, creating material evidence of American abundance that arrived in German homes and contradicted Nazi propaganda so effectively that some recipients were questioned by the Gestapo. The chocolate became equally symbolic. Hershey's chocolate bars, simple American confections, represented a technological achievement that few German civilians realized. American chocolate production during the war actually increased, despite wartime rationing of sugar and cocoa. German prisoners could buy Hershey bars at the canteen for approximately 10 cents each. By 1944, some prisoners had accumulated sufficient resources to purchase enough chocolate to fill care packages sent to their families. Letters of gratitude from German families receiving American chocolate arrived at the camps, creating a feedback loop of psychological impact. German civilians who had been told that America was exhausted, starving, on the verge of collapse, received parcels from American canteens via prisoner correspondence. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. The work itself became another demonstration of American productive capacity. Prisoners labored in agricultural settings in the American heartland, witnessing harvests of scale that exceeded German production. A single farm in Kansas could produce more grain than entire German provinces. The mechanization was complete, almost every task assisted by machinery. Prisoners working in fields alongside American guards observed mechanical reapers, threshing machines, and grain elevators operating with efficiency that rendered traditional German agricultural methods archaic. The message was clear to every prisoner. America was producing food in such abundance that it could afford to feed prisoners well, pay them for labor, and still maintain a surplus. Obergefreiter Adolf Berger wrote, "Today we harvested wheat. The American farmers use machines that require only 3 men to accomplish what would take 30 in Germany. The efficiency is almost frightening. We prisoners harvested enough wheat in one day to supply a German village for a month. I understood then that we could never have won this war. Not because of weapons, not because of tactics, but because of this productive capacity, this abundance. America doesn't need to ration because America produces enough for everyone." The accumulation of personal possessions reflected this abundance. Prisoners with 80 cents daily wage could gradually acquire items that German soldiers at home could not. Good soap, writing paper and envelopes for correspondence, toothbrushes, razors, combs. These simple items represented luxury by German standards. The contrast with correspondence from home was stark. Letters from Germany described soap shortages, poor quality hygiene products, and the necessity of improvising replacements from rendered animal fat. Here, in captivity, prisoners could purchase commercial soap bars. The psychological impact of this minor luxury cannot be overstated. It reinforced repeatedly the message that American economy operated under fundamentally different principles than the German war economy. By 1944, as prisoners accumulated months of wages, the economic disparity became impossible to rationalize through Nazi ideological frameworks. Some prisoners attempted to maintain belief that this was temporary, that American abundance would eventually end, that Germany would recover and surpass America, but the evidence mounted. Year after year, the canteens remained stocked. Year after year, prisoners received their 80 cents daily. Year after year, American agriculture and industry produced in such abundance that even enemy prisoners lived better materially than free citizens in the German homeland. Some became so accustomed to relative wealth that the prospect of repatriation became genuinely frightening. They would lose their wages, they would lose access to the canteen, they would return to Germany and face the deprivation that their families had endured while they lived in relative comfort. The statistics accumulated by the time of repatriation revealed the scope of the economic experience. Approximately 371,000 German prisoners held in America earned a collective $80 million in wages. This money was credited to individual accounts. When prisoners were repatriated, they received their accumulated savings in the form of checks or wire transfers, money that arrived in a destroyed Germany and provided capital for reconstruction and survival during the immediate post-war period. Many prisoners returned home with more personal wealth than they had ever possessed. That wealth, earned in American captivity, was often used to help families survive post-war deprivation. Some used accumulated savings to purchase farms, start businesses, or rebuild homes. The wages earned in American captivity became foundation capital for post-war German reconstruction. Obergefreiter Müller was fortunate. His family home in Bavaria had survived the bombing. His parents were alive, but he found them living in a state of deprivation. When Müller was repatriated in 1946, he carried with him approximately $250 in accumulated savings. To his family, it represented wealth beyond imagination. He purchased food on the black market. He paid for his mother's medical treatment. He eventually used the money to repair their home. Decades later, in an interview conducted in 1985, Müller described the psychological transformation. I was paid as a prisoner. I lived better than free soldiers in my own country. I accumulated wealth in captivity that I used to help my family survive after the war. The paradox was so profound that it broke every assumption the Nazi government had taught me about capitalism, about America, about what was possible. I realized that strength doesn't come from sacrifice imposed by government. It comes from production, from freedom to work and retain the fruits of that work. That realization changed everything. The wages represented more than simple economic compensation. They represented a philosophical statement about how American society valued labor. Even enemy prisoners were entitled to compensation for work. Even prisoners possessed economic rights. The system was transparent, documented, and honored. When prisoners were paid, they were actually paid. There was no deduction for propaganda purposes. There was no rationing of their wages to support state priorities. The money was theirs. In contrast, German military wages had been subject to constant deduction for war bonds, social insurance, and other state purposes. By the end of the war, German soldiers received wages that were largely confiscated by the state. American prisoners received compensation that was entirely theirs. The difference seemed minor, but represented a fundamental philosophical divergence between the two systems. The canteen purchases took on additional significance when analyzed as a form of soft power. American military command understood that providing prisoners with consumer goods, with the ability to purchase luxuries, with economic dignity, would have psychological effects. Prisoners who received wages and could make purchasing decisions retained a degree of personal agency. They were not merely detained, they were employed. They were not merely fed. They could purchase supplementary goods. The system was humane not out of abstract principle alone, but as deliberate military policy. Create economic dignity, and prisoners become more cooperative, more peaceful, less likely to attempt escape. The policy worked. German prisoners in American camps had an escape rate of less than 1%. The vast majority remained content with their circumstances. The letters home describing purchases at the canteen served as accidental propaganda. Families receiving correspondence that mentioned purchases of cigarettes, beer, and chocolate responded with a mixture of disbelief and longing. How could a prisoner have access to goods that were unavailable to free citizens? How could an enemy captive live better than soldiers in the Wehrmacht? The letters themselves became contraband information. evidence of American abundance that circulated through German society and contributed to the erosion of morale on the home front. By late 1944, significant portions of the German civilian population knew that prisoners in America lived better than soldiers at the front. The psychological impact on military morale was profound and negative from the Nazi perspective. The work that generated the wages became increasingly specialized as the war progressed. Prisoners worked in factories, on farms, in construction, in forestry. Every category of work was compensated at the standard rate. Some prisoners became skilled laborers, performing specialized tasks. The American system maintained wage equality among prisoners. This eliminated competition based on skills and prevented resentment. It also meant that every prisoner, regardless of the difficulty or skill requirement of their labor, had access to the canteen economy. This equality was remarkable from a German perspective, where military pay had always been hierarchical, with officers earning substantially more than enlisted men. Here, prisoners were compensated equally. American democracy extended economic principles of basic equality even to enemy prisoners. By the end of the war, the accumulated prisoner wages represented substantial capital in American camp economies. Some prisoners had saved $500 or more. This was money they would take home. In a destroyed Germany facing immediate post-war deprivation, $500 represented unimaginable wealth. It could purchase black market food. It could fund rebuilding. It could sustain a family through the winter. German prisoners who had worried about repatriation to deprivation returned home with financial resources that many free German citizens lacked. The irony was profound. Prisoners of war returned from captivity wealthier than free citizens of their homeland. The wages earned in American captivity became the foundation for immediate post-war survival and eventual reconstruction. The psychological transformation that resulted from this economic experience extended beyond simple gratitude for good treatment. It represented a fundamental intellectual challenge to Nazi economic theory. The Nazi state had argued that capitalism was inefficient, that capitalist societies were weak, that only the centrally planned economy of the German Reich possessed the productive capacity to support modern warfare. The experience of German prisoners in America directly contradicted every element of this argument. Capitalist America not only had the productive capacity to fight a two-front war, but had surplus production available to pay prisoners, stock canteens with luxury goods, and provide labor compensation that prisoners could actually retain. The experience demonstrated that capitalism could be both productive and humane. The lesson was not lost on prisoners who would later help rebuild Germany as a capitalist democracy. When prisoners were repatriated and released from camps, they carried with them not just accumulated wages, but transformed understanding. Some became advocates for economic reform, arguing that post-war Germany should adopt capitalist economic principles. Others became businessmen, using accumulated savings and American contacts developed during captivity to establish trade relationships and partnerships. Still others entered government service, advising German leaders on economic policy informed by their experience of American abundance. The practical knowledge that prisoners had gained became intellectual foundation for post-war German reconstruction. Obergefreiter Müller eventually used his accumulated savings and war service experience to establish himself in the timber business, supplying lumber for German reconstruction. He became moderately successful, built a comfortable home, and sent his children to university. Decades later, he reflected on the significance of those 80 cents daily wages. It wasn't the money itself that mattered, though the money was important to survival after the war. It was what the money represented. In America, labor was valued. Workers were compensated. The capitalist system actually worked as advertised, providing abundance and economic opportunity even during wartime, even to enemy prisoners. We were told that capitalism was decadent and weak. Instead, we discovered it was productive and generous. That knowledge changed how I understood economics, how I understood freedom, how I understood what was possible. I returned to Germany a believer in capitalism, not because of ideology, but because of experience. The wages earned by German prisoners of war in American camps represented more than simple military policy. They represented a statement about the value of labor, the dignity of workers, and the capacity of a free economy to produce abundance. The 80 cents daily compensation, seemingly modest in absolute terms, became the vehicle through which German soldiers learned that American strength was built not on sacrifice imposed by dictatorship, but on productive capacity sustained by economic freedom. The canteen purchases, the cigarettes, the beer, the chocolate, became the physical manifestation of that learning. And when prisoners returned home with accumulated savings, earned from wages paid even to enemy soldiers, they carried with them knowledge that would help rebuild Germany into a prosperous democracy. The simple economic act of paying prisoners became one of the most significant psychological and ideological operations of the war. It was never designed as such. It was simply the result of American military policy to compensate labor fairly, to treat prisoners humanely, and to demonstrate through everyday economic practice that capitalism could produce abundance and dignity. Yet in that simple act of paying 80 cents daily, American democracy taught German prisoners a lesson about economic freedom that no propaganda campaign could have achieved. They learned it by living it. They learned it by earning wages they could actually retain. They learned it by walking into a canteen and purchasing luxuries that symbolized a nation of incomprehensible productive power. And they carried that lesson home, where it contributed to the foundation of a democratic, capitalist Germany that would become America's ally and partner in rebuilding Europe. The victory wasn't achieved by weapons alone. It was achieved by wages paid to prisoners, by canteen goods freely purchased, by the simple demonstration that free people working in a capitalist economy could produce more than a dictatorship and share that abundance more widely, even with enemies.